My name is Anatoly Sharansky. Well, you see, I am 3 years old refusnik. It means that for 3 years already I am fighting for my right to live for Israel.
Just over a year ago in Moscow, World in Action interviewed Anatoly Sharansky. His main concern was human rights. He wanted the right to emigrate, and while he was still in the Soviet Union, the right to criticize the authorities, including the policemen from the KGB who often spied on him.
They're KGB men, and each KGB man is at the same time a photographer or anybody else who he has to be. And some of you have noticed some of them making pictures or even films of those people who are present there.
You've seen people taking pictures of those who are present there?
Yeah.
Okay, perhaps we better let you get back to the
Yeah, we have to go back now.
I'll help you.
Okay.
As Sharansky walked off with his friend Vladimir Slepak into a Moscow suburb, many wondered whether he would one day push the KGB too far. After we left, Sharansky went on arguing with the Soviet authorities. He demanded the right to associate freely with Westerners, to make uncensored telephone calls abroad, and to demonstrate. For a further 12 months, the KGB put up with him. Then, on March the 15th this year, their patience ran out. The message from Moscow was short. Anatoly Sharansky has been arrested. Tonight we build up a picture of the last year of liberty of Anatoly Sharansky, the man who went too far.
Sharansky is one of the leading personalities of the Jewish emigration movement and also one of the leading personalities of the Helsinki monitoring groups. He's in double trouble.
What is the accusation against him?
Чего обвиняют его?
Я не слышала обвинения, еще не было никакого...
Sharansky's wife, Natalia, is in London. All she knows is that her husband has been arrested and is under investigation. There's been no formal charge.
Сказали, что мой муж бандит, и так пишет газета «Известия».
I don't know what he's charged with. There's not been any trial yet. The people in the KGB and in the Soviet Union and in the embassy say that my husband is a crook.
Criminal.
We first met Sharansky in Red Square in April 1976, while making a program about Soviet citizens who wanted to emigrate. Most of the film shot then was shown last year, but some was not, and has been included in tonight's program. The sound quality is variable because we were filming with amateur equipment. Permission wasn't sought from the Soviet authorities. Sharansky publicly demanded the right to leave the USSR. Last year, he told us what it felt like to assert this right in Soviet society. This interview hasn't been shown before.
Ever regret your decision to take a stand against the Soviet government?
Oh, never regret. First of all, I want to say that not against the Soviet government, but for my right to emigrate. But I never regret it, though my life now is much more dramatic. But you see, now I live in peace with myself, in inner peace, I mean. And there is no constant irritation because of impossibility to say what you think and to behave in such a way as you do want. It's very important.
Do you feel that you will ever change your mind the other way?
No, never.
How long do you think you'll have to stay in the Soviet Union?
Who knows? I wait for a visa for 3 years, and I hope to get it as soon as possible. My wife is waiting for me.
Natalia Sharansky came to London last month from Israel for a demonstration in support of her husband. Mrs. Sharansky left the Soviet Union only 1 day after her marriage to Sharansky in 1974. She hasn't seen him since. Both applied for exit visas. She got one. He didn't. When she saw Sharansky in our film, she said, "It was like another meeting with my husband." The demonstrators come from all over Britain. Most of them are Zionists, supporters of the State of Israel. Many have never been to the USSR. They see the case of Sharansky in simple terms. He's another brave Jew jailed for wanting to go to Israel. For others, the story has a different background. Arriving with her husband is a woman who knows both the Soviet Union and Sharansky well, Lyudmila Alexeyeva. She's not Jewish. Lyudmila has been active as a human rights campaigner in Moscow. Now, in one of the USSR's mysterious decisions, she's unexpectedly been allowed to emigrate. Lyudmila sees the story of the last 12 months in a different perspective from most of the Jews here.
Sharansky believes that not only Jews, but everyone should have the freedom to choose where to live and work. It is the moral duty of every citizen in the world to fight for Sharansky's release.
Mrs. Sharansky is the main speaker at the rally.
Ladies and gentlemen, Natalia Sharansky. Hello? Yes.
Eventually, the microphone was fixed. Mrs. Sharansky told the crowd in Hebrew that they should never rest until freedom came to all the Jews of the Soviet Union and Anatoly was released. Most of those marching to the Soviet embassy think Sharansky is a victim of Soviet anti-Semitism. For Ludmila, the arrest is linked to a much wider issue. Will the Soviet Union honour a new formal undertaking on human rights? The prelude to our story of Sharansky's year begins in Finland. In August 1975 at Helsinki, the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev signed a new international agreement. Brezhnev promised that his government would give Soviet citizens certain basic rights.
The Soviet Union will respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of thought, conscience and religion for all. The Soviet Union will encourage the effective exercise of civil, political and social freedoms, all of which derive from the inherent dignity of the human person.
It was a remarkable assurance for a one-party state like the USSR. Philip Windsor, reader in international relations at London University, explains why the Soviet Union signed the section that dealt with human rights.
Well, I think they signed the one on human rights because they were on a hook. First of all, it was them who'd pressed for the Helsinki Agreement because what they wanted originally was lots more economic exchanges with the West. Then when they got there, they found, rather to their surprise, that some of the Western powers, and again, including powerful ones like Germany, were saying, look, we're going to create a relationship between these, and unless you observe something on security, you might not get the economic deal you want. And unless you observe something on human rights, it might be smaller than you want. And they got so embarrassed, I think, that in the end, they did a quick signature and dashed off, effectively. They wanted to bring it to a stop as quickly as possible, even if this meant signing a package which they didn't altogether like.
When we met Sharansky in April 1976, Helsinki didn't interest him much. He just wanted to leave. We went home and didn't return. But in the year that followed, he found a new interest.
"7010, Michael Sherborne speaking."
For developments in Moscow in that year, we're largely dependent on recorded telephone calls.
Хорошо. Но у вас что слышно? Как дети?
The main channel for these is a London teacher, Michael Sherborne. His giant telephone bill is paid by Jewish sympathisers. The calls enable us to build up from this country a picture of Sharansky's last year of freedom.
Have you ever met Anatoly Sharansky?
No, unfortunately, except on the telephone. And from telephone conversations, he's become very, very close to me. I've had a number of letters from him, and I've spoken to him, I'd say, in the last 3 years, something like between 150 and 200 times on the telephone.
What kind of character does he seem to you to be?
Seems to me a person who's very intelligent. His degree at the university, his master's degree, is on the computer finishing of the end game of chess. And he's obviously a very intelligent person who exudes personality, friendship, and I would say leadership. And I get the impression that he is an obvious leader of the two groups that exist in the Soviet Union amongst the so-called dissidents.
Sherborne himself is active in Jewish politics and a strong supporter of the State of Israel. For him, Sharansky is primarily interested in Jewish problems in the USSR.
What kind of leadership do you think he exercises?
Well, he's first and foremost, I would say, a leader of those Jews who want to leave the Soviet Union, because fundamentally he is a Jew and a Zionist. His whole purpose at present is he wants to leave to go to Israel. But he is also one of the leaders of the Moscow-Helsinki group, which was formed under the chairmanship of Yuri Orlov and with Alexander Ginsburg, both of whom were recently arrested.
Last May, Sharansky switched over from mainly Jewish concerns to policing the Helsinki Agreement.
What is the Helsinki Monitoring Group?
It's a group that was set up unofficially in Moscow by a group of people who felt that the Soviet government was violating the undertakings which they solemnly signed in Helsinki. And they felt that their job was to report these violations to the world at large. And they've been doing this by collecting information and sending it abroad, publicly, for it to be published abroad.
And Sharansky is a member of this group?
Yes, indeed.
On May the 16th, the Moscow-Helsinki group was openly formed. Sharansky was a founder member. Vladimir Slepak, in whose flat Sharansky was to be arrested, joined later. Ludmila Alexeyeva, whom we saw in the London demonstration, was a co-founder. Professor Yuri Orlov, later jailed by the KGB, was chairman. Also there were Alexander Ginsberg, another prominent dissident now in jail, Ilyena Bonner, wife of Nobel Prize winner Andrei Sakharov, and 5 others. Ludmila Alexeyeva recalls the group's foundation.
When the group was created, we had in mind that we would help to implement the clauses of the Helsinki Agreement. If our government had decided to observe these clauses, we would have helped them as much as we could. But unfortunately, the information that reached us showed that the Soviet government was not prepared to implement the Helsinki Agreement and was not seriously considering the human rights section. In practice, all we had to do was to note the violations of these Helsinki clauses.
The group Sharansky joined announced publicly that it would examine sensitive areas.
The group will pay special attention to forcible psychiatric treatment of dissidents, inhumanity towards prisoners of conscience. The group hopes that its information will be taken into account at further international meetings which will discuss the agreements.
For the Kremlin, badly in need of Western trade, public accusations that they'd broken the Helsinki Agreement were worrying. Next month, a conference meets at Belgrade to discuss whether it's worth pushing ahead with the deal struck at Helsinki. And the group worked hard. During 1976, they put out nearly 80 reports on what they considered to be breaches of Brezhnev's solemn signature at Helsinki. Cases where, in their view, the Soviet authorities were failing to deliver the civil, political and social freedoms they'd formally guaranteed. The reports covered the imprisonment of dissidents in mental institutions like Kashenko Psychiatric Hospital, the rigid control exercised from KGB headquarters over free movement and expression of all kinds, and other alleged abuses. Ludmila talked of 2 further long-running grievances highlighted by the group's report.
The activities of our group since its foundation have covered the following areas. First of all, the right to hold religious beliefs. Second, the defense of national minorities before the law.
We've no film of Sharansky talking about the Helsinki Group's dossiers because checking on Soviet adherence to the agreement only started after we left. But national minority questions were important to him. Last year he talked to us about the trial of Mustafa Zhemilyov, leader of the Crimean Tatar national minority.
Who was the man who was sentenced?
Zhemilyov, he was Zhemilyov. I'm not acquainted with him personally, but many of my friends are. He was the leader of Crimean Tatars, who are struggling for their right to turn back to the Crimea, from where they were sent to Siberia in Stalin's years, and up to now they are not permitted. And for this struggle, he was sometimes already sentenced to imprisonment. Now he is in very bad health because of his long-time hunger strike. And now, once more, he was sentenced to 2.5 years of imprisonment.
2 years imprisonment?
2.5.
2.5.
Sharansky didn't get Zhemilyov out. But in July, he had more success with a dissident we'd met in Moscow, a Jewish student called Boris Levitas. Sharansky said he should be allowed to emigrate. The authorities said no, then, bewilderingly, yes. So 1 month, Levitas was on the streets of Moscow with Sharansky. A few months later, he was on the London demonstration. In October, things were still going well with Sharansky. Outside the Soviet embassy in London, demonstrators who'd met him told us he seemed confident and relaxed.
He was a very happy person, very lively, and he was a smiling one amongst a group of very serious and some sad people.
He was what I would call a bouncy personality. He was a person who was willing to take what the Soviets were dishing out to him and quite firm in his conviction to continue.
He didn't say what he had to be happy about, he just looked happy. He was the youngest group there, most of the people were older than he was, and he looked rather like a happy, smiling schoolboy.
Sharansky had cause to be cheerful. In the United States that summer, Jimmy Carter had been campaigning on a strong human rights platform. Soon he was president. He brought with him a more robust way of looking at human rights problems in the USSR. For President Carter, the Soviet Union was a member of the United Nations and had clear obligations.
All the signatories of the UN Charter have pledged themselves to observe and to respect basic human rights. Thus, no member of the United Nations can claim that mistreatment of its citizens is solely its own business.
No one knows for certain whether Carter's pronouncements were responsible for Sharansky's arrest. What is clear is that Soviet dissidents became a very popular cause in Washington last year. that the Soviet authorities ended up accusing Sharansky of being an American spy, and that the change in Sharansky's fortunes dates very roughly from the American president's new stand. In February this year, the KGB launched an attack on the committees that were checking Soviet adherence to the Helsinki Agreement. Already, Sharansky had sensed that things were going wrong. There'd been a demonstration in one of Moscow's main streets. Sharansky took a leading part and got 15 days in jail for hooliganism. We talked to more of those who'd been to Moscow at this time.
Why are you on this march?
Because I know Sharansky. We visited him when we were there. And as an extremely brave young man who's fighting hard, I wanted to come here and support him in any way that I could.
Sharansky and his friends sensed that something was in the wind.
What was the mood among dissidents in Moscow at the time you saw Sharansky?
We met a few people, and they were all very, very concerned that the authorities were likely to pounce very shortly on particularly those people who were on the Helsinki watchdog committees.
Soon the KGB moved in on two leading Helsinki group members. First, Alexander Ginsburg was arrested. Then Committee Chairman Yuri Orlov was jailed. And Sharansky started to feel the pressure. From the end of November, there was continuous surveillance over Sharansky. Usually 2 cars followed him everywhere. These 2 cars contained 8 people, and sometimes a 3rd car would join them. Yes, I often saw these cars, once when we were walking from my flat to the station. It was a snowy day and the streets were deserted. It was already dark and we were walking back very slowly. At the same speed that we were walking, the cars followed us. On the other side of the road, there were 4 people walking as shadows. Soon President Carter spoke again. He had no time, he said, for the idea that good relations with the USSR meant soft-peddling protests on human rights.
I don't feel that way. I think it ought to be clear, and I have made clear directly in communication to Mr. Brezhnev and in my meeting with Ambassador Dobrinin that I was reserving the right to speak out strongly and forcefully whenever human rights are threatened, not every instance, but when I think it's advisable. This is not intended as a public relations attack on the Soviet Union, and I would hope that their leaders could recognize the American people's deep concern about human rights.
President Carter wasn't worried about appearing to interfere in Soviet affairs. He even went so far as to name publicly an imprisoned Soviet dissident, a well-known member of Sharansky's group.
I regret very deeply the fact that the Soviet Union has now incarcerated Mr. Ginsburg, who has been the leader, one of the leaders in the Soviet Union, and representing the case of the dissidents.
In Moscow, the guards outside Slepak's flat, where Sharansky spent most of his time, were now on constant watch, and Sharansky was starting to get tired.
What was his mood the second time you met him?
Equally determined, but very, very tired, exhausted, both emotionally and physically, because he'd been subject to all-night searches and he'd been keeping watch with the other Helsinki search people.
Why had he been subjected to these all-night searches, did he say?
He said because he was part of the Helsinki monitoring group.
Or why should that particularly attract the KGB?
Because they're worried about the activities of these groups all over the Soviet Union.
Did he say so, or is that your assumption?
He said so.
The KGB knew that Sharansky was deeply concerned about his wife.
There was a bunch of about 300 letters which his wife had written to him from Jerusalem, and the KGB boys took the whole of this batch of letters, and he pleaded with them to let him keep them because, as he told them at the time, you've already seen these letters and censored them before they were ever delivered to me, and you might at least let me have them now.
Did the KGB say why they had taken his wife's letters?
No, they didn't. They just took them. And he felt it was an act of very great brutality.
But Sharansky could still get some letters out to Israel. He wrote to his wife, "My bodyguards are at the door, but I'm determined to write this to you. I realize how meaningless my life would be without you. Remembering everything, I've only one regret, and it brings tears to my eyes, that we have no children. But I'm sure we will have some soon, don't you think so?" On March the 5th, the government paper Izvestia published a damning open letter from a friend of Sharansky.
I, Sanya Lipavsky, citizen of the USSR, state that from 1975 I knowingly worked for the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, the CIA. I further state that Anatoly Sharansky, a member of the so-called Helsinki monitoring group, whom I know personally, was involved in these espionage activities.
The letter accused Sharansky of organizing a trade boycott of the USSR. Sharansky, it said, wanted to stop American firms selling to the Soviet Union because they were helping the Soviet war effort. But the accusation was vague and didn't say what Sharansky had actually done. Philip Windsor, reader in international relations at London University, finds the letter unconvincing.
And the whole letter in Izvestia looks as if it's been drafted by some kind of committee to say what's the best way of sneering people without making the charges too precise, to leave an impression without having to prove it.
What does the letter actually say?
What the letter actually says is that people like Sharansky and his associates start out by talking as if they're all concerned for human freedom. But when you get close to them, what are they really doing? They are subversives, they're working for foreign intelligence organizations, they're selling or giving information to the Americans, they are acting against the Soviet state, and this is their real motive. It's nothing to do with whether or not they care about human rights or human freedoms. It also, by the way, only names people who are Jews.
A year earlier, we'd filmed Sharansky at Passover. His friend Vladimir Slepak was there too. It was to be Sharansky's last Passover before his arrest. By the time the festival came round again, 4 of those present were being menaced by the KGB. Alexander Lerner, internationally known computer expert, had been named as organizer of the CIA's Moscow spy ring. Vladimir Slepak had also been denounced as an agent of the CIA. Joseph Bailin had had his flat searched. And Sharansky's year of freedom had run out. On March the 15th, KGB men came to Slepak's flat where Sharansky was staying. Sharansky was with a British and an American correspondent. 8 plainclothesmen seized him and took him away. Today, Anatoly Sharansky is officially under investigation on suspicion of crimes against the state. He's in one of the KGB's investigation jails. No one is allowed to see him. For the demonstrators outside the Soviet embassy, the arrest means only one thing: Soviet Jews are in peril. The march carried a letter to the Soviet ambassador for onward transmission to Moscow.
There is in the Soviet Union today a new wave of anti-Semitism. This atmosphere is the background of the notorious letter in Izvestia and the arrest of Sharansky. Sharansky should be released.
But for Ludmila Alexeyeva, Sharansky's membership of the Helsinki watchdog group is more important.
Why is Orlov in prison?
Because he is the leader of the Helsinki group.
Why is Ginsburg in prison?
Потому что он активный член Хельсинской группы и распорядитель Солженицынского фонда помощи политзаключенным в Советском Союзе.
Because he is an active member of the group and he is an administrator of the Solzhenitsyn Fund for political prisoners in the Soviet Union.
And why do you think Sharansky is in prison?
Потому что он активный член Хельсинской группы и активист еврейского движения в СССР.
Because he is an active member of the Helsinki group as well as a Jewish activist in the USSR.
What might the penalty be?
Well, he hasn't yet been charged, so it's very difficult to say what the penalty could be, because this is still only a smear campaign in a letter to a newspaper. But if the charge could be anything, it could be working against the interests of the Soviet state, which can send you down for 10 years, or it could be treason, which could be death.
Next month at the Helsinki follow-up conference at Belgrade, supporters of Sharansky will raise his case. Meanwhile, the Soviet embassy is unmoved by the clamour about the Helsinki group. As Natalia Sharansky went on hunger strike outside, the embassy refused a visa to British lawyers trying to get to Moscow to defend Yuri Orlov, the group's leader. They also refused to talk about Sharansky or say whether or when he'll be charged. We put a call through ourselves to Moscow to find out. Michael Sherborne telephoned for us during one of his daily roundups with Soviet dissidents. We asked him to get through to Andrei Sakharov, a close friend of Sharansky. His wife Ilyena is on the Helsinki committee.
Ringing.
The Soviet authorities allow dissidents to give a good deal of information over the phone. They're pledged to facilitate the free dissemination of information of all kinds.
Hello, Yelena. Можно говорить, пожалуйста, с Andrei Dmitrievich?
Ilyena too knows Sharansky. He used to translate at her husband's press conferences. What happened when Sherborne asked for news of Sharansky speaks for itself.
Здравствуйте. Может быть, вы знаете, что слышно у Анатолия Шаранского? Hello? 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 They've cut the line. As soon as I mention Sharansky's name, they cut the line.